Hello.
Our story begins inside of Finis Valorum's upper-class residence, just outside the senatorial district on Coruscant. He watched news reports fill into his office. He was lounging on a chair, like one of your French girls, watching thoughtlessly. Finis hadn't faded totally from the public since the vote of no confidence removed him from power. He definitely didn't hold the same sort of respect or even confidence to approach anyone on a galactic level. His politics were typically a secret to himself and his closest allies. At the current moment, most of those who considered him a friend were either out of office or Palpatine loyalists. The entire vote of no confidence left Valorum with a challenge: how to decipher his position in all of this. He, for example, watched a former Jedi Knight cultivate the minds of a third of the galaxy. The Separatist crisis, which is what filtered through the newsfeed right this instant, was led by Dooku of Sereno. Valorum knew him as Master Dooku back in the day. But the times were changing. A Naboo-born senator was leading the Republic closer to oblivion, and he was here, doing nothing. It's not that Finis hadn't attempted anything in years, it was the fact that no one really wanted to work with a disgraced Chancellor. This was from a business perspective, not from a public perspective. He was viewed as corrupt, and perhaps he was. The High Republic certainly had ended, and he wouldn't argue with that. But looking at the last 8 years of Palpatine's administration, he couldn't help but feel that he got the short end of the stick. Look at the stats. Valorum scrolled through his holo-device, searching for all the statistics his replacement racked up. Chancellor Palpatine dealt with the Blockade of Naboo that, by the way, he didn't do anything to help. The results would have been the exact same had Valorum remained in office. Ironically, the Coruscant-born Finis Valorum would have been less corrupt than Palpatine. His tax bracket on trade lanes, which led to the Blockade of Naboo, would have benefited the lower-class citizen more. That specific tax withheld the total monopolization of the Trade Federation and other megacorporations like it. Palpatine rescinded those taxes, which definitely earned him favorability with the pro-business sect in the Senate. It was just ironic in Finis's mind. Regardless, additionally to the nothing he did for his home world, was the court case with New Gunray. The courts were filled with Palpatine-selected individuals, and the Viceroy of the Trade Federation felt no pressure or faced any punishment for totally breaking Republic law. Oh, and also, who could ever forget that total fracture within the actual Republic itself? The Separatist movement, as it was being called by the news, was growing by the week, with new representation, additional systems, and support. The Republic was weaker than ever before, and Palpatine did nothing but spout the same bland speeches over and again. They worked on the Senate. Finis didn't see the same thing. He could see the lack of nuance and how little Palpatine really cared for the system he apparently represented. Call Valorum whatever you want. A silver spoon senator handed the galaxy upon his birth, but he actually cared about the Republic. That was something far more accurate than what Palpatine was saying and doing. That's when Valorum's attention switched from the holopad to the newsfeed playing in front of him. The newscaster revealed that there was a new vote going into the Senate rotunda at this moment. Finis leaned up, placing the device that was in his hands by his hip, and watched the newscaster reveal the coming vote information. The Senate was preparing for their next session, a brand new executive package called the Emergency Powers Act of 24 BBY. Valorum grabbed a vase next to his sofa and lobbed it across the chamber, watching 24,000 credits explode into a flurry of glass and plants. A few moments later, he'd pick the plants up and find them a new home. Afterwards, he would clean the mess up. It wasn't something that the maids needed to concern themselves with. That would be wrong of him. During his cool-down minutes, while cleaning and finding a new home for the plants, he'd speak to himself. He was betrayed. Truthfully, he couldn't believe it. Always coming second best. The Senate never respected what he tried to do, and now Palpatine was going to just skip a term limit because of a Separatist crisis he started by being complacent. Luckily for Valorum, he was slightly obsessive-compulsive. He couldn't stop himself from scanning over documents, legal speak, and movements within the Senate as the years passed by. So he had a list on everything that the Palpatine administration did to isolate itself from the rest of the galaxy. His new term limit needed to be stopped. If that was the end of Valorum's legacy, then so be it, but he would not surrender the Republic to an autocrat in the making. Thus, he began his work. Finis, motivation-wise, was not in this purely for revenge. Sure, it would be a fine excuse to try and mess with Palpatine, But Valorum knew better than that. He understood that, typically, nothing is personal in politics. Palpatine's move wasn't to harm Valorum out of spite with the Blockade over Naboo. It was clear that the current sitting Chancellor just wanted his opportunity to rise, which, sure, anyone would do that, but dismantling Republic tradition for self-fulfillment was not something Valorum could be complacent in. He gathered his documents, spoke to a few allies, and gathered his advisors for a speech. The Senate vote wouldn't go through until tomorrow, but it was important to gather public attention. Valorum's image in the public eye was very broken, but people did want to know what he was up to. This move was something Finis had been saving up for. Whenever he was in the public, the tabloids would gather as much information on him as possible. Valorum saw this as his chance to get everyone's attention in one move, because it was truly his first vocally spoken political statement in years. That was the brilliance of silence. Also, another reason he'd been so absent from politics, and the entire sphere around it, was due to threats he received following his removal. There were those inside the Senate that planned to blackmail him. He had a couple of bounty hunters wake him up with a knife to his throat, warning him of not getting involved. Valorum, after all, despite being a public servant, was always an upper-class citizen. So, these threats were something he took seriously. As an elite-born resident of Coruscant, he needn't concern himself with the endangering of his life for the benefit of others. Unlike the young senator from Naboo, Padme Amidala, he never put his life into danger to protect others. Valorum was always a policy man, and that kept him out of harm's way. So even though he was making a move to potentially help the Republic, Separatists, and maybe the Jedi, he was not some morally righteous person for doing it. He was protecting the Republic tradition, and perhaps maybe his legacy at most. Nothing more. When the following day came, the former Chancellor arrived inside the Senate building, with a swarm of paparazzi following him. Finis didn't say anything. He smiled and waved as he walked towards the rotunda. No one would dare be seen in public with him, which he understood. The Coruscant native quietly kept to himself. Questions were flung his way, and the most he told them was to keep their cameras on him. Even in defeat, even with his lowest approval rate seen in generations, he was still parading himself around with a modest confidence. News networks picked up on this immediately and displayed it. People theorized about what he could be up to here inside the Senate building. But the conclusion for most of these political analysts was correct. He was here to challenge the Emergency Powers Act. The Senate session would start nearly 40 minutes after his arrival, and he'd use the Coruscant representatives' pod because they were good friends still. Valorum waited for his opportunity, as Mas Amedda and the co-signers of the bill took the stand to explain some of the benefits it would have for Chancellor Palpatine. The bill wasn't just focused on Palpatine's term limit. More than anything, it was assisting him with other executive privileges. Calling it an emergency powers bill, or simply a term extension bill, was just for the public. The interior of the rotunda knew the truth about Palpatine's on-the-surface aspirations. They were going forward with this bill, primarily because of the business success Palpatine brought. He was great for credits, but not really for maintaining a positive diplomatic environment for non-core residents or people that couldn't afford to live in the core. The Senate quieted down following Mas Amedda's surrender of the floor, essentially asking if there were any individuals present wishing to make a final stand against the bill, whether it be for minor changes or completely denouncing it. Valorum's pod slowly moved forward, and the former Chancellor was met with a few boos and a couple of jeers. Valorum didn't bow his head, he didn't surrender himself, he just stared directly at the camera bots encircling his pod. The former Chancellor took a deep breath and looked to those he once called peers, and he reintroduced himself to the galaxy. He was Finis Valorum of Coruscant, here representing the people of the galaxy, and questioning the chances that this emergency powers bill of 24 BBY was an attempt to secure autocratic authority. In that moment, the air inside the rotunda slipped out, as people recognized this as a direct challenge from the former Chancellor. Was this a revenge plot? Perhaps Valorum had dirt on Palpatine. People everywhere were focused on the next words Finis had to speak. His little influence may have dissipated, but he still held the floor like a popular man, because he could change the entire dynamic of the Separatist crisis. Let's not forget that several key Separatist systems still had representation within the Republic. Their pods in this very chamber were still occupied by senators that listened to Valorum speak. He placed his hand around the control console in front of him. He felt like a junior representative again. Back in his day, years ago, decades ago even, when he gazed upon this Senate rotunda with wonder and amazement, when he believed in what a democracy could be. He at that age also didn't realize that he'd be the last of the Republic chancellors. Valorum would echo his thoughts aloud for the Senate around him, but that wouldn't come yet. He challenged this bill and called it strictly anti-democratic. The Senate was tearing itself apart by giving power to a man that took power for an incident with far lesser repercussions. Valorum demanded justice for the actions that caused the deaths of over 100,000 on Naboo just 8 years ago with the Trade Federation blockade. Newt Gunray hadn't been dealt with. He didn't have a sentence yet. However, Palpatine's court was in control over the case. Odd how Newt Gunray continues to be in power with the Federation's influence after the tax bracket was removed by Palpatine himself. Coincidence is it not that the Chancellor has motivations to rise beyond just an elected official? Not only was he calling out the failure to punish Gunray for his actions nearly a decade before, but bringing up minor policy actions that led to this crisis with the Separatists. Valorum wasn't ignorant enough to just come here and suggest that the Separatist crisis started because of Palpatine. He understood that they all contributed to it, and even took a part of the blame himself, which helped firm Palpatine's supporters at least see that the humility was coming from Valorum. He, for instance, contributed to the Separatist crisis by vetoing bills that would have withheld monopolization in lower-income territories near Hutt space, or, for example, his accidental, though foolish, mistake in canceling a military creation package that would have supported independent contractors in the Upper Rim near Megiddo. Had he not vetoed, the Trade Federation wouldn't have had a monopoly over that territory because of their droid armies. However, what the current administration did not only amplified the problem, but was a direct causation of the rise of a separatist movement. Think of it like this: the Republic had become so corrupt, so greedy, that a Jedi Master left the Order and started a political career just to challenge the rise of the new administration. There was no coincidence there. Dooku may have left the Order prior to Valorum's removal, but his political career didn't start until Palpatine became Chancellor. The Senate watched, people across the galaxy listened, and political analysts on every major network jotted down notes and exchanged them with their colleagues. Valorum then, without even missing a beat, brought up 4 different bills or actions that directly led to the rise of frustrations from non-core worlds. Firstly was the Umbaran embargo, a threat levied by the Palpatine administration to completely neutralize supplies from a specific system. The Umbaran embargo wasn't just targeted at Umbara, but a long list of other surrounding systems. It prioritized the Republic's relationship with the Commerce Guild and punished small businesses in every system it touched. The bill was also highly supported by Palpatine for supposedly bringing jobs back to the working class, while also completely shattering their hopes of letting the working class escape their binds. It did nothing but crush their home-created jobs. Instead of local businesses, the big power players came in and paid people at a rate lower than the local industry paid, while also outperforming them, thus making the smaller businesses lose their business and force everyone to work for the Commerce Guild, which, basically put, was paid slave labor. Valorum continued into the Debana gas procurement deal, which was very similar to the Umbaran embargo. Unlike the crushing weight of the Commerce Guild crawling down on local systems in the Mid-Rim, the procurement deal bought up resources gathered by local businesses, so that the Republic could steamroll the industry with a new model. They pumped the gas more efficiently and at a cheaper rate, but they also oversold or overpriced. This forced several non-core systems to struggle and eventually fall behind. Valorum brought up some statistics to aid his point. The Debana gas procurement deal was just a figurative assistant. As promised by the Senate, it would make the necessary material cheaper for the people of the galaxy, but it did the opposite. According to a Republic Senate census taking the previous year, people in the Mid-Rim couldn't afford to keep up with the competitive prices that had no real competition. In the core, it certainly made life more challenging for the average citizens, but due to higher budgets to work with, they could afford it. The Mid-Rim simply could not. people looked from the former Chancellor to Palpatine, who watched with frustration visibly being shown on his face. He was being challenged for the first time since being a senator. He hadn't had to deal with a rivalry in 8 years or so, and it peeved him. But Valorum continued mentioning off the other 2 examples he brought to the stage: the Techno-Union subsidy package and the expansion region tax. These were 2 bills passed and created by the Palpatine administration to quote-unquote bring the economy up following the failure of Valorum's trade route tax. So instead of taxing the Federation on their operations, which basically monopolized the trade routes, the administration countered with these 2. Both of these came out in the same year as the Blockade of Naboo. Basically, the budget created by Valorum's administration accounted for the credits they were supposed to get from the trade route tax that affected the Federation. When that tax got removed, the Republic would have been in debt for the annual cycle, so they created alternative methods to balance the budget, or basically maintain the paychecks senators received and hurt the lower class. The Techno-Union subsidy wasn't a subsidy at all, because it didn't keep prices competitive. The tax given to the Techno-Union was certainly given, but their major products went up in sales tax price. So simply, the sales tax on every item sold by the Techno-Union went up. Their prices remained the same. The Republic took a piece of the cake and made more with it. In the first year, this doesn't really change lives, but 3 or 4 years in, those credits started to add up, especially outside the core. Now, the expansion region tax was something similar to the aforementioned subsidy, though this tax was for something that didn't really come up from anything. It was reported falsely in 32 BBY that there was an increase in pirate raids across the expansion region. This, ironically, as Valorum found out years after his administration, came from someone deeply embedded within Palpatine's camp. The expansion region tax basically increased taxes so that the Republic could provide relief for a problem that didn't exist. Sure, people saw more light cruisers patrolling every so often, but truly about 1/10 of the actual budget went to the expansion region. And oh yeah, Valorum didn't just conjure this information up out of nowhere, it was public information. However, sometimes a public is just as complacent as its government. Valorum told the galaxy, and told the Senate, that without Palpatine's rise, the separatist movement itself wouldn't exist. These were just 4 examples within the Senate, and he could list dozens more, others that were even more aggressive on the lower class. Finis continued, demanding that the Senate think about their constituents. They were each guilty of making selfish decisions inside the Senate, and he did not deny that. But continuing the Palpatine administration would destroy the Republic. Their society needed change. It needed new administrations to change everything up. And simply put, the Palpatine administration was a failure. He didn't end there, because Valorum actively recognized the potential threat coming from the Separatist crisis. But again, it wouldn't be there without nearly a decade of active deceit. The Republic's goal should be to pacify this movement, remove these bills, even if it puts the Republic temporarily into debt. A strong economy is only as good as a little guy. Without them, the backbone of society, then there is no greater structure that exists. The oligarchs can fill their pockets for their entire lives, but it wouldn't change the active decrease in society. They could think they would save themselves, but they were going down with the ship anyways. Valorum stated it here and now, submitting to the people that he would surrender his generational wealth, his residence, and his future so that the people of the Republic could free themselves from this self-destruction. It slipped out. Valorum was in the heat of the moment, but when the words came out, he actually didn't regret it. It felt powerful. He felt like a true civil servant in that moment. He recognized what it meant to care about his constituents. This wasn't even about serving himself or filling his own pockets, or attending galas on Hesperidium. It was about the people he represented, the fact that the Republic tradition did not allow for autocrats. Silence filled the rotunda. People were shocked, not just on Coruscant but elsewhere in the galaxy. Valorum had just proven himself to be a changed man, and no one knew what to say or do about it. Well, no one but Palpatine. The current sitting Chancellor stood up and reminded the people of the galaxy what Valorum had done. The truth is, Finis couldn't pretend that he had a seamless tenure as Chancellor. Some of his bills maliciously tore people from their homes. His administration couldn't be considered perfect, and Palpatine actively removed unpopular Valorum legislation, aiding his own popularity as the new Chancellor. Palpatine didn't stick himself on Valorum's failures, but he reminded the galaxy why he had no power to begin with. His failure to listen led to this. Palpatine defended himself, but he looked weak. The current Chancellor had a list of legislative choices that did actively hurt the galaxy, and Valorum did too, but they weren't nearly as malicious. At least, they didn't seem so. There'd be some short bickering before the Chancellor and Valorum surrendered the floor of the rotunda to make a final decision, and it would go straight into a filibuster, which in this case was kind of a mix of a recess and a prolonged vote. Instead of sitting in session for the rest of the night, the Senate would disperse. See, this wasn't a functional government. The senators didn't have time to sit here and listen to reason for why they should or should not pass a vote on the Emergency Powers Bill, so everything came to an end for tomorrow. Once Valorum exited the rotunda, he was pressed immediately by the tabloids. Was he being truthful about his willingness to surrender his lifelong earnings? What about his remarks regarding Palpatine's administration? Was he planning yet another campaign to fulfill his final term? What were his goals here? Yes, everything was answered. But there was one key response here that would save his life, without his knowledge. He told the tabloids that he planned on going home so he could let the Republic play out everything it needed to, on his own. He had full trust, rightly or not, in the capability of the Senate to do what was right for the people. This was his way of remaining politically correct, without upsetting either aisle of the Capitol, and simply remaining a neutral entity. Before he could leave the Senate building, following a short interview with the media, he'd be apprehended by members of the Separatist coalition inside the Senate. It should be stated that several of the key Separatist players, like Mina Bonteri, didn't want to lead the Republic. They were public servants. They wanted to help the galaxy. However, they proved their willingness to make a change by siding with the Separatist movement. It was their way of rebelling against the status quo. These individuals grabbed Valorum's attention and requested his audience. This too would save his life. As he was visiting with these members, a bomb would go off inside of his residence, killing off some of his maids and his cook. He wouldn't learn about it until several hours later. Instead, as the galaxy believed former Chancellor Valorum was killed after returning, he'd be locked into a deal-making process with the current Separatists. Trying to impeach a growing autocrat wouldn't work, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. Without the desperation of war, the Senate wasn't likely to make a move. Valorum's neutral placing made him a valuable asset for those still trying to save the Republic. These senators did not want to leave the Republic, not because of fear, but simply due to the fact that it would take so much more effort and be so much more difficult and time-consuming to rebuild an entirely new galactic government. It would benefit all of their constituents if they just retrofitted the current system to best work for everyone. It's why they were so interested in gaining Valorum's aid. Now, truthfully speaking, former Chancellor Valorum had very little interest in helping individuals trying to break away from the Republic. He disagreed with some of them on policy positions, and he wasn't inside the Senate because of some of them. He was here because of Palpatine's overreach of executive powers. If these planets broke away into a separatist movement, that didn't faze him. Again, he wasn't some morally great person. He was in the gray. He existed for himself and the Republic structure as a tradition. So when these people tried to gather his support, he scoffed at them. He called their desperate acts foolish, because the Republic would only pull back. If they wanted to see real change, they had to stop pretending a pretentious Jedi with familial connections, basically an oligarch, would promise them anything different than the Republic would. If they wanted change, true systematic change, then removing Palpatine and repealing whatever executive orders or bills he signed off on would be necessary. Valorum was flustered for a while, before eventually telling the senators to utilize the amendment clause. While the problem would remain, Palpatine's stance, it could forestall the passing of the Emergency Powers Bill. Basically, Finis was proposing that the Separatist coalition propose that the bill be turned into an amendment, but for the opposite reason. The bill itself, if passed, would reward Palpatine with executive control, but it would just be his administration, no one else's. Inversely, an amendment of the same topic could be utilized to reduce executive powers in an era of crisis. Since Palpatine was at the heart of everything, it would elongate his term, but it would also make him basically powerless as a chancellor and as a leader. Essentially, Valorum was suggesting a functional government shutdown, where the government would still work, but it would literally stop working for anything else. It was an old Republic law that he learned about because of his hyper-focused professor during his young adult life. It never left Finis, and now he found a place to use it. What this amendment voting process would do consisted of a couple major movements. Palpatine's term was at an end already, but a Chancellor could not be replaced until an amendment was ratified. In legal speak of the Constitution, in this specific circumstance, the Chancellor could only legally vote on the amendment, nothing else. No bills, no executive orders, nothing. It forced the Chancellor to make a vote on the specific amendment so that once it was ratified or vetoed, they could democratically step down and pass power on to the next individual, because this specific Chancellor would have no other power over anything else inside the government once their term ended, which Palpatine's was about to end. Now, this was the brilliance of Valorum's plan. If Palpatine held out on voting for the amendment, or vetoed it, against a popular vote from within the Senate, he'd be withholding the government from functioning by himself. It would make him the main villain of the entire process. Of course, he could try and gather allies within the Senate to vote against the amendment, but if proposed in the right form, it could get passed, or turn people against Palpatine. The government needed an executive branch, and with the approval of the budget coming right around the corner for what should be the next administration, credits would just sit in gridlock until a vote went through, because the budget couldn't be voted on without the executive branch, and the executive, the Chancellor, would be stuck in gridlock because he didn't want to vote for an amendment that wouldn't benefit him. The two alternatives were Palpatine winning the vote and remaining Chancellor, or the amendment would go through and ensure that the executive role lost more power when a crisis took hold, specifically right now. Valorum did suggest that they frame it as hopeful to rebuild a fractured society as possible. He left promptly, before being taken away by Senate commandos. Finis was clearly done with this, but when he learned of an assassination attempt, he realized that if it weren't for the Separatists, he'd be dead. That bombing nearly destroyed half a block of the resident area. 13 people were killed, with another 24 injured. Valorum would be escorted to a secret location, as he was forced to decide on his decision going forward. The next few days would see the amendment proposal overrule the filibuster, stopping the government from functioning entirely. On one side was the pro-Palpatine coalition, mostly just because he was an aisle pleaser. Those who he made happiest during his tenure supported him. This did mean that individuals from both sides jumped into one corner, making it more likely that others could join the other coalition. The opposition was filled with members of the Separatist group and individuals who refused to sign onto the Emergency Powers Bill. Without Valorum's momentous return, people were less likely to vote against the bill, but due to his arrival in front of the galaxy, the people were more willing to challenge Palpatine, because if a disgraced Chancellor could, then why couldn't they? Even though Finis didn't show himself following the attack on his manor, he did keep an eye on Republic debates. The media covered the incident, and there was genuine pressure from the people of the galaxy to withhold the Emergency Powers Bill. It was also on the other side as well. The 4 aforementioned moves made by Palpatine's administration were put under a microscope for everyone to see and look at. The public hadn't really considered the true ramifications, and because so many people were simply taken aback by Valorum's return, they were able to hear his statements in front of the galaxy. Sure, some of them were slightly skewed, but again, it was all public information. He was just handing it over to them, so that they could use it for themselves. The Republic struggled though. Passing the amendment put the Republic directly into gridlock, and Valorum removed himself entirely from the situation. Basically, an individual went in, told people to do something, and they actually did it. As a reformist during his administration, he learned from his failures, the petty political squabbling that swallowed him whole. The Senate actively pushed for change, but Palpatine refused, and every day as the Senate returned with more information, pros and cons, including some vicious debates, little changed. There were people who swapped sides, thinking that they could outvote Palpatine, but it never really went anywhere. What the Republic needed was to have a 2/3 majority vote for the amendment. When Palpatine vetoed it, the Senate would need to beat him with a 3/4 majority vote, which was nearly impossible. But since there was also some leeway, Palpatine held out. The irony is, despite the Sith forcing the Separatists to act more towards separation, they didn't actually really want to act on it. They listened to Dooku's word, but what Valorum said was also true. Dooku was no different than the Republic. He was a Jedi oligarch with a pretentious view on the galaxy because he believed his Jedi powers enlightened him. He thought so highly of himself that he abandoned an order that had stood for over 1,000 generations. The people didn't really like the Jedi, so don't misconstrue that, but they respected the institution a lot more than the individual Dooku, and that became a thorn in the Sith plan. Without Dooku's word holding as much influence as it used to, there was nothing for him or Sidious to do. They had some minor incidents to try and stoke the flames, like for an example, the suppression of a population that sided with the Separatist demands, and even the activation of one of the sector defense fleets. This didn't really give off the right message either to the galactic populace, one that hadn't seen combat or any war in their lifetimes. This was a step too far. The Chancellor was activating anything he could to maintain his role, to silence the opposition, which was supposed to help the Separatists leave the Republic instead of sign the amendment, but it made them fiercer inside the Rotunda. While yes, the Chancellor's powers were greatly reduced by the ending of his term, these weren't exactly his choices. They just happened to fall under the umbrella of his administration. So it certainly was intentional by the Sith. It was viewed by the public as weakness though. The mobilization of the small Republic military force, which wasn't even officially Republic, was the Chancellor signaling his bitter defeat, last grasp for power. War changes people. The Republic hadn't seen true, real conflict for hundreds of years. This move by Palpatine was nothing but agitation, something that could turn the Republic against itself. It was clearer than ever before that the Separatist coalition wouldn't have formed without Palpatine being elected. But see, Palpatine's move was realistically understandable, and it should have worked. The raising of this Republic military was meant to quell the rise of a potential Separatist threat, but that was also the trick. Valorum may have remained out of the public spotlight, but he acted as an advisor for the Separatists. There were some promised incentives from several senators if they got what they wanted, so he obliged to get something out of it for himself. Finis proposed that the representatives tell Dooku one thing, and then do the opposite. He theorized that Dooku and Palpatine were working together in some form, because they did speak frequently when they were both Jedi and Senator. It was a bait and switch. To the Republic, it would appear like a light mobilization from Palpatine's administration, but it was just a trade fleet, nothing real, not even a threat. So when Palpatine's troops entered airspace over a specific planet, it looked like a hostile takeover against a trade fleet. Not really a good look. The articles of impeachment, therefore, were thrown into the Senate floor, as the Chancellor refused to vote against the Emergency Powers Bill. The Senate and population were furious. Those who supported Palpatine the most started to back away to save themselves from political scrutiny of being seen by his side. For many of those people, it was too late. Their association with someone so relentless lost them respect in the eyes of the Senate, and especially their constituents, who would decide in the next election. The next 2 weeks would be grueling galaxy-wide, with the budget sitting untouched on the Chancellor's executive desk, Palpatine being impeached and apprehended for inciting a conflict, and the instant unity between what was originally rivaling sides. The galaxy had a reaction. A new Chancellor would rise in Palpatine's place, a moderate from the inner rim world of Onderon. The elegant Senator Mina Bonteri won over the hearts of her constituents, both in her leadership against the threat of Palpatine and in breaking the filibuster amendment. The Republic would stand. Dooku's influence would vanish almost overnight, but it would not be the end. Palpatine may have been arrested, but like Gunray, the courts were deeply protective of the individual that put them in the power. Palpatine was both wealthy and an important politician. The courts would defend him, even if they believed it was wrong, because he gave them their power. Mina, in the first few weeks, had to sign the budget and disperse funding to assist struggling locations without funding from the government. She was in a tough spot, but the citizens of the Republic were willing to be more forgiving. However, just because the Separatist dream was dead, didn't mean the Sith weren't still Sith. The clone army was 2 years away from being fully ready for action, and Darth Tyrannus was without his master, Grievous, and Ventress. The necessary components to waging war on the Republic existed, to much lesser degrees, but were still present. The Techno Union, Commerce Guild, and especially Trade Federation would listen to his demands. They were in an alliance. The Federation was still a bit iffy there, but they would probably join him. Destroying the Republic was their end goal anyways, but without a separatist government, that became a little complicated. Tyrannus spent Mina's first few weeks in office gathering intel and making a decision for himself, which did involve gathering the Trade Federation. Sidious was a true Sith, Dooku lesser, but he could still perhaps utilize traditional Sith tactics to make the mark on the galaxy he believed to be positive. So, following the release of the budget and the restructuring of the Republic, war was declared by a rebel state. Without an actual separatist movement, aside from a few very poor worlds hoping for change, this attack came directly from Federation battleships with Union and Guild troops landing on the surface of their target planet, Ryloth. The people of the galaxy were blindsided by this, and Mina Bontiri, the Chancellor, stood before her people without wavering. Their new amendment had prepared them for this. Her executive powers shrunk, but her voice grew louder. She remained a motivational voice of reason, calling upon her colleagues to put into work the Republic Protection Act, otherwise known as the RPA. See, while Dooku was preparing for war, the Republic pulled back on Palpatine-era restrictions, so they had leftover credits. The 4 major political moves referenced by Valorum were for Republic income, but Palpatine also put a ton of money into various sectors that didn't really benefit the average citizen. Mina repelled those, and before she could start spreading the budget to help everyone equally, the Republic was attacked. Ergo, the Republic had a lot more credits to work with because they hadn't spent their budget yet. The RPA came with a list of incentives, the first of which being the total boycott of any company aligned with Count Dooku. This was immediately accepted by the people of the Republic. The Jedi also joined the Republic by siding with the Senate and preparing for war against their former brother. The RPA added an additional request for volunteers, and due to recent political drama, people weren't especially patriotic about the Republic. But this was, again, the first true conflict seen in hundreds of years. With the people coming back together and siding under someone who looked poised to join the Separatists, citizens were dedicated to fixing this thing. Dooku's attack was like a chain reaction. It woke the galaxy up. Their own public complacency had cost the galaxy time, and now they needed to ready themselves for war. Mina's RPA came with a few extra incentives to lessen taxes on everyday goods in exchange for rations, which people agreed to. This was her way to protect Republic citizens while focusing on the actual Republic military complex. Without the clones or anyone knowing about them, this war would immediately be fought between the Republic and the rebels. Volunteers were no match for battle droids, but the boycott led to concern from Dooku's allies. They could all be high and mighty about their power, their droid forces, and their alliance with Dooku, but they were still businesses at the end of the day. War was meant to be profitable for them, but their distributed materials were being burnt. They would not see profit from any of that. Protesters did everything they could to make sure these businesses didn't profit off of anything, so shops, mines, anything that assisted the supply chain seized up. And sure, these major power players had automated factories and facilities, but if those are shut down by angry mobs, then what? This wasn't a faction war, one of government versus another. This was the declaration of war on the entire galaxy, and the people were forced to unite after their time of trouble. Sure, yeah, of course, a few systems betrayed the government to side with the attackers, but they were few and far between. Anyways, if someone sided with Dooku's regime, they'd be ostracized from society. Didn't matter if it was a person or a local planetary government. Mina Bontiri attempted to be diplomatic, but she took up the part of wartime leader naturally. Threats for her life came. She handled them with grace. Inside her cabinet, the young senator from Naboo, Padme Amidala, assisted her with everything she could. Having survived the blockade over Naboo, she was more than willing and ready to take a stand against the Federation again. As this war started and the Republic scrounged up anything it could for defense, the courts flipped their position on Palpatine. This came with new appointments from the Senate, thanks to a judiciary expansion bill, placed inside the RPA itself. It permitted the Republic to hold more control over the full government without Palpatine's influence. The death penalty as a result would also be given over to the former Chancellor, and Sidious would make his escape. He would never actually get off Coruscant though. The Jedi had guards in the facility in case Palpatine loyalists tried to break him out with a riot. When Palpatine showed off his dark powers, the Jedi Council would be sent in to deal with him, leaving Tyrannus the last of the Sith. Now, Dooku was in a weird position. The business leaders were getting second thoughts. their industries were plummeting. That was something no one really considered because the charisma Dooku displayed was inspiring. He made people feel like they had a chance to do something, when in reality, even if they were actually winning the war itself, which they were, there'd be nothing left for them if they won. The galactic community was united as one because of them. Didn't matter who it was. Hell, even Mandalore threw themselves in with the Republic. It was everyone versus a few powerful, greedy conglomerates. Instead of a battle ending the war, because the Republic certainly didn't have the capability yet, it would be the self-destruction of the rebel leadership. Dooku had no issue leading, but the powers in control over these armies either gave up or used their military forces to escape into the unknown regions so they could at least have a semblance of power. Their chance at control was long gone, and they didn't see it before they attacked. The Techno Union would stand by Dooku for a little longer than the rest of them, but it was all still doomed from the start, thanks to the day Valorum stepped into the Senate Rotunda. The war for the Republic, and thus the galaxy, came to a conclusion without a battle. One day it just stopped, with nothing notable being remembered about that final skirmish. Dooku remained public enemy number 1, but he'd never be brought to justice. Other Sith-like individuals faded from relevancy. Even though Dooku escaped a prison sentence, he would never truly be free. His mind consumed him, and his prison would follow him everywhere. Dooku hurt the galaxy, made it worse. His pain, his betrayal of Qui-Gon and Sifo Dyas, it all meant nothing. His last thoughts, surrounded by his isolation, would be on his failure, a personal purgatory never ending, before leaving the land of the living. The Republic, inversely, was forced to chug along following the outrageous attack by the most powerful conglomerates in the galaxy. At their attempt to bend the knee, they would be dismantled by the government. All of them, Techno Union, Federation, didn't matter. Mina was far less forgiving than even some senators would have been. She navigated the stresses of this tumultuous time with ease. Her cabinet supported her, and Mina came out on top. By having repealed Palpatine-era policies, she was able to save herself and her budget, following the several-month-long conflict. The RPA remained in effect until the total destruction of the aforementioned corporations. However, the RPA would cost taxpayers for years to come. It wasn't because of the bill itself, more of the transformation it underwent. After the rebel crisis, the Senate voted to create an emergency military. And no, it would not include the clone army. The Kaminoans would actually attempt to breach contact, and the Republic completely denied anything, forcing the clones to sit on Kamino. A similar threat would arise from them, but similarly, nothing would come from it. At least, this would have no conflict to share in. Despite his importance to the actual change, Valorum returned to his own new apartment, and continued lounging on the sofa. He saved the Republic by accident. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of his politics. He had always been involved for perhaps the right reasons, but never did it actually work out to benefit the people of the galaxy. Only through an accident could he start a domino effect that could change the fate of the Republic. Mina's rule, because of this butterfly effect, would begin a new motion of legislative change, creating a new power party within the Senate, forcing the removal of old, more corrupt faces, thanks to the Rebel Crisis. Mina's leadership, in the end, would be the defining moment in this history, a leader who surrendered power so that the Republic could survive, the true antithesis to everything Chancellor Palpatine planned to be. And that, my friends, is another C-SPAN Star Wars story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the C-SPAN. I wanted to play with having a really morally gray character here. I feel like if you use like a Vader or like a conflicted Anakin, it's like, yeah, it's good or light. And I guess you could consider a gray Jedi that, but I really wanted to work with a morally gray character as like the main character here. Valorum, I think, is the perfect use of that. He has no real reason to be involved here, and truthfully speaking, that's why he didn't get involved in canon. It was kind of hard to come up with a motivation because I don't really see him having any other motivation than just believing in the Republic. And that really felt just the most accurate to him. He only cares about the tradition of the Republic, not really what happens outside of that. I also kind of see Valorum as like this disgraced political figure that does nothing but kind of sit and dwell in the current politics, and so I have every reason to expect that he'd have a whole list of just things that Palpatine's administration did in case the opportunity presented itself. In this case, it does here. As for the Sith, obviously the Sith try and kill him in this story. Once he becomes irrelevant, once he stops really hanging around the Senate and just kind of falls off the face of the earth in this story, the Sith stop focusing on him. The Sith would honestly be in a really tough bind here. The Separatists not really wanting to lead the Republic is like their worst nightmare. Like, if you give the Separatists a chance to get what they want without leaving the Republic, I think the Sith plan is kind of doomed. And that's why this domino effect is like so crucial. It's that it's not even intended. It's really just an accident that goes from a molehill to a mountain. And that's really the story, the emphasis of the story. So I hope you all enjoyed the C-SPAN. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.